Our final speaker, Anne Nolan, is going to join us remotely, so we might switch to Anne shortly, but I'll just give you a brief introduction to Anne. Anne Nolan is known to many of you, I'm sure. She's an associate research professor at the Economic and Social Research Institute in Dublin, the partner organisation for this brilliant conference. She's an adjunct professor in economics at Trinity College Dublin. She's also a research affiliate at the Irish Longitudinal Study on Ageing, TILDA, at TCD, and on the study team management group of the Growing Up in Ireland study. Her main research interests are health economics, with a particular focus on social determinants of health, population ageing, and healthcare financing. And I think that's very much the area she's going to bring us through now in the next presentation. So,
okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks very much to the organisers for the invitation to speak to you today about health inequalities in a changing environment. And this is joint work with colleagues at the SRI, Sean Lyons and Greta Maughan. So what I'm going to sort of give you a bit of background to start off on is around the whole issue of health inequality. So we know that differences in health across the population are pervasive. So no matter which way you slice the population by socioeconomic position, things like ethnicity, health is not distributed equally across those characteristics. And in Ireland, for example, life expectancy at birth varies by up to 5 years between those living in the most and the least deprived areas. So you can see that illustrated in the chart on the right here. So if you take the figures for males, for example, you see that those living in the least deprived 20% of areas across the country, the dark blue line, their life expectancy at birth is just over 84 years. For men that are living in the most deprived 20% of areas, that's 5 years less. It's just over 79 years. The similar gradient, slightly less for women. It's about 4.5 years difference between those living in the most and those living in the least deprived areas. But it's not just life expectancy, and it's not just across deprivation that you see these inequalities. You see broadly similar patterns for other countries, for other health outcomes, and using different indicators of socioeconomic position. So things like education, social class, income, and wealth. And I'm going to illustrate that here with data from Eurostat for a couple of different indicators of health using different indicators of socioeconomic position, just to illustrate that these inequalities really are pervasive and exist regardless of the measure of socioeconomic position or the health outcome that's observed. Obviously, the sort of magnitude of the differences can differ, but you still see this pervasive inequality in health outcomes. So the chart on the left here is the proportion of the population age 15 plus who report depressive symptoms in 2019. You can see for both EU 27 countries and for Ireland, there's that gradient across education levels here. So the darker blue line is those that have lower secondary education, that's their highest level. And the grey line then on the right is those that have a third level education. And you can see for the EU 27, for example, it's about twice as high in people who have lower levels of education. And you see a similar gradient then with a different indicator of health status. This is the proportion of the population reporting a sort of a chronic, long-standing illness. And this time with a different indicator of socioeconomic position, which is household income. And again, you see that social gradient in that health outcome. So why do these inequalities exist? So there's been quite a lot of work done by organizations such as the WHO, the European Commission, to sort of explain why we see these inequalities and what we can do in terms of policies to try and mitigate them. And broadly, it's the conditions in which people are born, grow up, work, live, and age, and sort of more broadly, people's access to power, money, and resources that are the major drivers of health inequalities. And you can see that here in the diagram on the right. So, you know, at the sort of red sort of center level, we have things that really are outside of our control, our age, sex, and our kind of genetic factors. But then there's a whole other set of layers of influences on our health that are generally modifiable. So things like our health behaviors, smoking, diet, physical activity, but then more broadly, the sort of broader conditions, the social conditions in which we live. So things like our housing conditions, our working conditions, and the broader environment in which we live. And that's what I'm going to focus on for the rest of this talk. And just a couple more sort of observations on health inequalities. It's observed that you see this gradient in health outcomes from the least advantaged to the most advantaged. It's not just simply a difference between those at the top and the bottom. And you will have seen that in the charts that I presented earlier. It's also true that the determinants operate at all stages of the life course. So if you look at health outcomes, for example, in very early life, things like infant mortality, right up to things that would be more pervasive in older age, or health conditions in older age, you see these inequalities operating at all stages of the life course. And this means really that these inequalities, they require action on multiple policy fronts. So it's not just simply about access to healthcare. We see these inequalities in countries that have universal healthcare. So it's not just health policies, it's things to do with, for example, welfare and income support, housing conditions, and environmental conditions. And in Ireland, this is well recognised in policy. So Healthy Ireland, which is the strategic framework for health and well-being in Ireland, one of its 4 key goals is to reduce health inequalities. And the outcomes framework of Healthy Ireland sets out a key set of indicators to monitor progress. And I suppose most importantly for what we're talking about today, they note that the indicators will be disaggregated where possible in terms of things like age, gender, socioeconomic status, and geography, to allow sort of monitoring of progress and also comparison with national and international data. So it's not just enough to sort of present these indicators, but it's also important to drill down in how they are distributed across different sectors of the population. Similarly, there's a commitment to health inequalities and Sláinte Care, the sort of healthcare reform programme. And then, as we have heard from Lena at the Department of the Taoiseach in the context of the Wellbeing Framework for Ireland, sets out these set of indicators that sort of monitor broader indicators of quality of life. There's an increasing focus on the equality dimension there as well. And as she noted, there's poor performance on the environment, climate, and biodiversity theme at present. So focusing a little bit more on the environment and health inequalities, the European Environment Agency in 2018 noted that despite improvements in environmental quality across Europe over time, inequalities in exposure to and the impact of environmental conditions across socioeconomic groups persist across Europe. And they've done some initial analysis of this, so looking at the sort of joint distribution of socioeconomic status and the distribution of environmental conditions across Europe to see whether those living, for example, in more disadvantaged areas have higher exposure to sort of things like air pollution, poor water quality, noise, and other environmental pollutants. And they've done some analysis at a very sort of aggregated regional level. So this is NUTS 2 level across Europe, of the association between various indicators of socioeconomic position and environmental exposures, things like air quality and noise. And you can see here the results of one of those analyses, which is looking at how PM 2.5 and PM 10, so these sort of key environmental exposures for air quality, are distributed across quintiles of the population that are disaggregated by levels of education. So you can see that there's broadly a gradient across areas that are defined by different levels of education. So starting on the left-hand side, areas that are most advantaged, they have higher shares of their population with higher levels of education. They have lower levels of PM 2.5 and 10 as areas that have much lower levels of education on the right-hand side. But I suppose the one of the key conclusions from the EEA analysis was that the association between socioeconomic position and air pollution, as one example, was found to be highly location and scale specific. And they did make a case for research at much more granular levels. As I mentioned, the analysis that I'm showing you here is based on NUTS2 regional aggregations, which are really large regional aggregations used by the European Commission. So that's where we're coming in this project. So what we're doing here is we're focusing on what the EEA call the spatial overlap of environmental hazards and social vulnerability. There's a much broader and a sort of a growing related discussion on how socioeconomic groups differ in the way in which environmental hazards impact on their health. So for a given level of an environmental hazard, those in different socioeconomic groups may be impacted differently because, for example, they live in different quality housing. But we're not going to deal with that today. So as part of our research program funded by the EPA, we're going to try and I suppose build on the analysis that was done in the EEA report by looking at much more granular regional levels in Ireland to look at how socioeconomic status and environmental conditions are sort of jointly distributed. So what I'm going to show you today is some very preliminary analysis that we have started as part of that program. So it's very descriptive, but I suppose you'll get a good flavor, I suppose, for what we're going to try and expand on in the broader project. So the environmental exposure that I'm going to talk about today is concentrations, annual concentrations of PM2.5. And these are data from sort of spatial or rather satellite data. And we have data, annual data going back to 1998. So I'm going to take data for 2002 and 2016 because that corresponds with the census of population data, which is where we get our information on socioeconomic status. So socioeconomic position data comes from the 2016 census of population, and it comes from the small area population statistics. And what I've done here is we've chosen sort of 3 broad indicators of socioeconomic position. We're also looking at an indicator of ethnicity, but we still need to do a bit of work on that. So we're taking the proportion of a population without third level education, that are in semi or an unskilled social class, and that are in non-owner occupied housing. And we're looking at a spatial level at the distribution of these socioeconomic characteristics, allied then to the distribution of air pollution. And as I mentioned, it's matched at the level of the 2016 census small area. And these are sort of very small areas. There's over 18,000 across the country, which correspond to about 100 households. And they're sort of very relatively socially homogenous within those small areas. So first of all, it's instructive to ask what has happened to air quality over that period, 2002 to 2016. So this simply plots the average PM2.5 level in each of the small areas, in each of those 18,000 small areas across the country for 2002 and 2016. So there's 2 things to note here, I suppose. First of all, there's a broad, improvement in air quality. So much darker levels of green in the first map relative to the map for 2016. But I suppose secondly, it's really difficult to sort of drill down into what's happening in small areas because there's so many of them. So in this chart then, what I'm showing you are just a snapshot for some of the Dublin small areas. So you can see again, that sort of broad trend of improvement in air quality. And you can also see how air quality varies across different areas of the country. Not surprisingly, it's much higher in sort of city centre areas than it would be in more suburban or rural areas. So the next part of the project then obviously is to show how socioeconomic position varies across small areas. So again, we've done this for the whole country, but what I'm showing you here are just the snapshots for that sort of Dublin area, just because it's easier to see what's going on in this chart. So basically what I'm showing you here are the share of the population in each of the small areas that have less than a third level education. So basically darker colours represent more disadvantaged areas. And you can see, I suppose, consistent with what we know about the Dublin area, there's higher proportions of more lower levels of education, sort of north and west Dublin than there are in sort of south Dublin. Similar issue then when we look at the proportion of the population in each of the small areas that have a semi or unskilled social class. Again, darker green represents more disadvantaged areas. There's something a little bit odd, I think, going on with UCD there, that dark blob you see on the bottom of the chart. So we'll have to figure that out a little bit more, but possibly due to the way in which social class is assigned within households. And then secondly, or thirdly rather, we look at the distribution of non-owner occupied housing. A little bit more of a nuanced picture here, much higher levels of non-owner occupied housing in the city centre, as you would expect, but also sort of higher levels in some of the coastal areas in South Dublin, which we might not have expected. So I suppose this really highlights the importance of looking at different indicators of socioeconomic status and really drilling down into small areas. So then the final part of the project then that I'm showing you today is sort of putting all these pieces of information together. So we know how socioeconomic status is distributed across small areas. We know what the corresponding levels of PM 2.5 are. So is there a relationship between them? So do people in more disadvantaged areas, are they more exposed to higher levels of PM 2.5? And the answer really is pretty nuanced, and it depends on the indicator of socioeconomic status that we're looking at. So what I'm showing you here is average levels, annual levels of PM 2.5 on the y-axis, and how they're distributed across small areas defined on the basis of the share of the population without a third level education. So moving from left to right on the X or horizontal axis, those at the left-hand side are the most advantaged 20% of small areas, and those on the right are the least advantaged 20% of small areas. And you can see that it's kind of a U-shaped relationship here. So it's not just the case that those in the least advantaged areas have higher levels of PM 2.5. It's also the case that those in the most advantaged small areas have higher levels of PM 2.5. And remember that these data that I'm showing you here, these are summarized for the whole country, so not just the Dublin area. We see a similar pattern, a kind of this U-shaped relationship when we look at social class. But when we look at non-owner occupied housing, we see something that's probably closer to what we would have expected to see earlier on, which is that those living in the least advantaged areas, so those that have the highest share of non-owner occupied housing, are exposed to higher levels of PM 2.5 than those in the more advantaged small areas. So in terms of preliminary conclusions and next steps, we know that the natural and built environment is an important component of the social determinants of health. And there is increasing research and policy focus on how inequalities and environmental exposures translate into health inequalities. So as I mentioned, it's a key policy objective of Healthy Ireland to launch a care and the wellbeing framework to reduce health inequalities. An analysis by the European Environment Agency at NUTS 2 and NUTS 3 level across Europe has shown some relationships between things like poor air quality and exposure to noise and socioeconomic factors across Europe. But there was a need highlighted in that report for much more granular spatial analysis. And that's what we're hoping to do through this research program at the ESRI. I've shown you some very preliminary results and really sort of set out the methodology that we're going to use for the project. So this preliminary analysis of census small area points to inequalities, but further modelling is required. And we need to understand, for example, why we see different patterns using different indicators of socioeconomic status. We're also hoping to extend this to analyse other environmental exposures, things like NO2, access to blue and green space, for example, and also other indicators of socioeconomic position. So what I've shown you so far are sort of individual level or household level indicators of socioeconomic position, but we can also think about much more composite indicators, things like area level deprivation, which was one of the indicators that I showed in the very first chart, looking at how life expectancy varies across areas defined by their sort of overall or composite level of deprivation. And they might be able to sort of tell us different things about these relationships between socioeconomic position and environmental factors. So I'll leave it there, and there's a set of references on the slides and have further details on what's been presented.